Every now and then something happens in history, something that's seemingly self-contained to its time and place, but ends up having an impact on the entire world. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. Think the JFK assassination or the Treaty of Versailles and its effects on the German people. But when considering this, we are making one vital mistake. We are thinking how something happened. How 9/11 caused the war and terror. We are not asking the more important question. Why it happened. So let's cast our mind back 2,000 years to a moment that would not just change an empire, but the world. But before we get started, make sure to check out my channel for more historical mini documentaries. And if you're enjoying the old footage used in the background of these videos, make sure to check out my other series, Past Lens, for more. This question, though simple in its structure, requires a deep level of exploring in order to sufficiently answer. We are not simply attempting to identify the modus operandi of the assassins like some Agatha Christie whodunit, but also how the world around them pushed them to such extreme measures, ending the life of their fellow man and their superior. But first, we must break the question down to its most basic level and specify who that man was. To know why Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, we must know who Caesar was. First, we must discuss the legacy of Caesar. Discussing Caesar's future post-assassination may not immediately appear relevant in answering the question, but it does in fact help us. In understanding the implications of this Roman general, we gain a far greater understanding of those who would have wanted him dead. In fact, many of his successors would go on to use the name Caesar. Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and the first of these successors, provides us with a solid point of reference for this. After Caesar's death, he was named his nephew, thus making him heir and the next ruler of Rome. This meant that Augustus could use the name Caesar, as he did, as we can see in material evidence from the time, like coins which say on them, Caesar Augustus. Although there was indeed a blood relation between the two, the pair were not father and son. Despite this, Augustus realized the gravitas the name Caesar had amongst the Roman people and across the empire, and ensured to remind as many people as he could that he was a Caesar, like we see in the aforementioned coin, which would have been passed throughout the empire and perhaps even beyond its borders. Throughout his reign, Octavian would continually harken back to the concept of Julius Caesar as a great leader and a fine Roman. Known for his shrewd mastery of propaganda, Octavian erected various statues of his adoptive father and had him fondly remembered in poetry, and even had Caesar deified after a comet was seen at his funeral games, thus making Octavian the son of a god, or Divi Filius in Latin. Later emperors would continue to use the title Caesar for both status and lineage reasons. Another way in which we can see the weight of the title Caesar is in Augustus's rival and Julius Caesar's own military ally, Mark Antony. Antony too understands the power just one name can have in public appearance, and persistently tries to prevent Octavian from claiming it in an attempt to undermine Octavian's new right to rule after being claimed as heir to Julius Caesar. Now I have addressed the sheer magnitude of influence Caesar had after his death, we gain a clearer idea of why he may have garnered so much attention from the men who would eventually take his life. Next, we must realize why this attention was negative attention, why Caesar's growth to such heights seemed to pose an ideological threat to his peers and enemies alike. I have already spoken about after Caesar's death, but to do this we ought to acknowledge the time before Caesar's rule. Before Julius Caesar was a man named Sulla, who, like Caesar, seized power of the Republic through force. Sulla waged 2 civil wars against Rome, aptly named the Marian-Sullan Civil Wars, in order to secure his position as a dictator. In doing so, Sulla successfully dismantled all stability in the Roman Republic and joined the path of dominoes, which would subsequently lead to Caesar's assassination. Despite being enemies, Sulla and Caesar's grasp for power mirrored one another in many ways. Caesar infamously crossed the river Rubican with his forces from the north and marched on Rome, as an act of civil war in 49 BC. Sulla also marched on Rome with his forces 40 years earlier in 88 BC, however this time from the east. Another example is that after successfully seizing control, they both passed a number of controversial reforms to reshape Rome in their separate visions. This repetition of history showed that Julius Caesar's assassins recognized one important lesson perfectly summarized in 1905 by George Santayana when he said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Although Santayana was not referring to Sulla or Caesar, his suggestion here is clearly one shared by the men who took Caesar's life. The conspirators witnessed in real time that Julius Caesar was moving the Republic in much the same way Sulla did, and, learning from Sulla's time of instability, they were pushed to take drastic action to ensure Caesar could not continue down this path, and further dismantle the Republic and undermine what they saw as Roman democracy. However, it is also important to consider the differences between Sulla and Caesar, as this self-scrutiny reduces the risk of tunnel vision and may lead us to a more accurate answer as to why Caesar was assassinated. One key difference between Sulla and Caesar was in their approach to their adversaries. Sulla was known for his unforgiving cruelty, with some notable exceptions, punishing those he saw as threats even after becoming dictator of Rome. In fact, Julius Caesar was one of these supposed threats and had his name published in a list of those seen as enemies of Rome. Caesar, however, appeared to see his fellow Romans with more compassion, even granting amnesty to those who previously opposed him and allowing them to hold senatorial positions. One particular instance which highlights Caesar's attitudes towards his enemies in the civil war is when the Egyptians presented him with the head of Pompey the Great, Caesar's main rival in the war and the head of the Republican resistance. It is said Caesar wept as he did not wish to see his enemies dead, only defeated. It could be argued that this clemency was part of the reason why Caesar was assassinated, or at least an instrument which enabled the conspirators to pursue this act of tyrannicide. It is important to remember that this compassion did not extend to his enemies outside the borders of Rome, as is seen in the triumph after his conquests in Gaul, where he publicly executed Vercingetorix, the main tribesman who led the Gallic resistance, by strangling him to death with his own hands. It appears, however, that Caesar's lenience was not enough to calm the Republicans' distress. Caesar's goal of repealing the Republic and presenting himself as a king in all but title was far too great a sin to be forgiven, even at the price of their lives. Even during the civil wars, this was evident. We may consider Cato, a great Roman statesman, orator, and key head of the Republican resistance, who defended his belief in Roman democracy until his final breath. When it became evident that Caesar had broken the Republican resistance and was on course to victory, Cato decided that he would rather fall on his sword than become a pawn in the fall of the Republic, and thus commit suicide. This shows us that the differences between Sulla and Caesar were not great enough to deter the conspirators from taking Caesar's life, reinforcing the previous suggestion that Caesar's similarities to Sulla contributed to why he was assassinated. Ultimately, there was one main difference between the two Romans. Sulla was stopped by worms in his stomach. Caesar was stopped by traitors in his senate. Now that I have identified Caesar's past and future, we may better understand why he was assassinated. The very men who Caesar granted amnesty and allowed to fill his circle observed who Caesar was replicating and who he may become. They understood the implications this would have on both the Republic in their own time as well as Rome's future. The days of stability in the Republic were over, and in a desperate conspiracy to recapture what they saw as the ideal political system, all the conspirators managed to do was fuel the fire. After Caesar was assassinated, the streets of Rome broke to riot. Would-be allies fought in desperate power struggles, and the Republic would be lost forever. The conspirators assassinated Caesar to save the Republic. However, they gravely failed. All their fears were substantiated. Power in Rome became even more centralized to one monarchical figure, the emperor, and the man they wished to suppress, Julius Caesar, was even deified.